So I thought maybe just shift the conversation just a bit. So each of these communities here have all been collected. We're going to use a little anthropology here. That have all been collected, and master narrative ethnographies have been written about each of the communities here. And this is not a test on those ethnographies, but famous anthropologists have worked in each of these communities, lived in the community or lived nearby, and secretly talked to people in 2 of the 3 communities in order to write those ethnographies. And the Anglo side thought it was very important that those ethnographies be written. And certainly as non-Pueblo people, non-Native people, you know, our perceptions are sometimes guided by those, as well as what Brian is talking about, which are these shelves of collections or objects or from the communities as well. So I'm just wondering about, this is the master narrative, perhaps, that community members, as scholars, as spokespeople for their community, sometimes have to overcome first. And sometimes it's a slow process. Sometimes it's like a big wall in front of people. And I'm just wondering if each of you could perhaps comment on those outside master narratives a bit, and in your own work, how that has been a facilitator at times, perhaps an obstacle at other times. And I see you're working on it, Diane. I was going to start with you.
Well, for Taos, it was Parsons. And it's the human toll that it takes on people who were informants and their families and who were found out, and it lasts. It's still known today, and that happened back in the 30s and 40s, and those families are still known for that individual who was the informant. So that's what matters most in our communities, is the violation, the betrayal, I guess, and there are motives. There were motives from the outside world that was, getting this key information. It's going to fulfill the world of knowledge, and they were doing it from a community or communities that were not open to that, didn't put that as a priority to disseminate information. In communities like at Taos, I was telling Woody that there are only certain people who know this stuff. And even those people who know this stuff it's a mystery to them. So what the anthropologists and archaeologists are getting the story, and they're getting it, but they're not, even I take it with a grain of salt, because I understand the conditions of what it was told. There's a certain amount of detail, but when I ask my dad about it, he can't relate to it because it's so old. It's so old, this information, that I was also telling Woody that the language in some of this stuff doesn't exist. So whether you're native or non-native, you've got to take all this stuff with a certain amount of grain of salt, But the things that matter to me are like Pablita's pieces, She made her own decision to draw what for her was contemporary native life at home. What was going on at home, the dances, making bread and stuff. And for me, that's what I look to inform me, is how those boots were tied back then. What kind of cape were they wearing as compared to now? That's, if you're talking to me about it, that's what matters. It's that knowledge, that religious knowledge, wasn't meant for the outside world in the first place, and yet it was. I think what I've come to understand is that in the Western world, not that I'm against it, because I value this exploration, but I also take it with a grain of salt. But there seems to be no limit to what Western academics in the pursuit of knowledge. There is no limit. That's the way people were raised, and that's the way it's always been. But in some communities, there is a limit within our own communities. So that's the stuff that I know.
Thank you. I know this is a difficult little territory here, but I think it's really important to understanding narratives in terms of what people like yourselves are doing at this point as compared to what's been widely available. It's still somewhat widely available. Diane's referring to Elsie Clues Parsons. There's a Taos ethnography that she wrote. It was all done on the sly, sort of outside of the Pueblo, at one of the hotels in Taos is what she's referring to. And it's one of the rarest books because it keeps disappearing from library after library, something else she didn't really talk about very directly, but indirectly. Now I'm wondering, just Diane, if I could ask a follow-up question about, is there anything in your work where you feel that you're a corrective to some of these past practices? In other words, we're talking about narratives, we're talking about interpretation, we're talking about the places where different worlds talk to one another. So I'm wondering if there's a spot in your work where you really think consciously about that and consciously try and work to correct the record or correct the stance of the outside world being so curious that way.
This sort of has something to do with what you're asking, and but I haven't had the opportunity to explore it. This concept of Pueblo people as, I guess what I'm trying to get at is the mixture that has existed since contact between Pueblo people and people from Mexico, people from Spain, all the human relationships, physical and religious and all that came together, that I think the misconception is that we're this kind of pure people. And you know, I'm informed, like when you introduced me, you said I was from Taos, but I'm not, you know, I was raised in Taos by my father, raised by my father's community, but my mother was from Okeawinge, and her grandmother was from Pilar, who came up from Mexico and settled in Pilar. You know, that's the story, and nobody's talking about it. I don't know why they don't want to talk about it, but it's true. And people who come from mixed cultures and mixed heritage, we know a lot because we have to see it work out, you know. And so that kind of has something to do with your question, but not really. It's really about what's missing. It isn't about us and them because it is this mixture. And then how people of mixed cultures who are raised in Pueblo communities, what our role is. And so because I come from a mixed culture, when you include the Plains influence, because of how tall I am, you know, those are 4 distinct influences on my life. I can't see it as one. I have to see it in these multiple contexts. And so that's the story that really needs to be told.
Thank you, Diane. I really appreciate you saying those things out loud. I think that's incredibly important. So the same sort of question for you, Woody. Let's skip to you in terms of looking at the sort of master narrative of San Ildefonso. San Ildefonso has kind of distinctive, several different master narratives because of the place of the arts and the community in the 20th century, which is a very recent development there in that way that it's been, and then the anthropological side. So I just wonder, for you, first of all, as someone of the community again, first, but then also how that may or may not impact your work in developing this narrative then about Tuño and how that sort of fits into that place.
Well, so for San Ildefonso, one of these early master narrative or ethnographies was Whitman. He lived at the Pueblo in the 30s, I believe it was. Took up residence there with the family. You know, and he wrote this, I mean, it's a relatively rare book. I'm lucky enough to have a copy of it. You know, which talks about, you know, the very mundane aspects of daily San Ildefonso life, like how people go about cleaning their homes, you know, how they care for pets, you know, and a lot deeper things like kind of religious aspects of San Ildefonso life. It's relatively rare. A lot of people don't get their hands on it at the Pueblo. I've shared this ethnography with others, and you know, the reactions are varied from very shocked to very intrigued. And so, you know, these narratives, they inform, you know, traditional people like my grandfather, for example. I mean, he's like my standard. I've always referred to my grandfather because he's like the standard for me. He's like the smartest guy I know. Any kind of work I want to do or talk about, if it passes muster with him, it's okay with the rest of the world. So I constantly refer to my grandfather. You know, but these types of narratives, they, you know, they're of interest to people like that, to traditional people, to just everyday Pueblo people. But like Diane said, they have to be taken with a grain of salt because, you know, it's one perspective written from one person. He may have had informants, but as we all know, like anthropological informants are coerced in many ways through, you know, many means. Parsons, of course, is famous for this. Her work with Joe Lente, for example, in Isleta, where, you know, she got him drunk, hotel rooms, and as a result, you know, you have all these you know, esoteric kind of knowledge disseminated to her and by extension to the public. And I've seen these records at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. So we have to realize that this knowledge is generated in very by a number of means. And I guess back to San Ildefonso, by extension, these ethnographies by Harrington, Bureau of American Ethnology, Edward Curtis to an extent, and Alfonso Ortiz to, you know, in a broader kind of Tewa sense, very revealing. And I'm highly critical of, you know, Ortiz's work. I've been so for a very long time. I wasn't exposed to these types of work until, you know, I got to UNM. You know, writing papers for David Stewart back there. You know, I'm going through, you know, works like Ortiz. I'm like, I didn't say holy cow, but you can imagine what I said. That, you know, that like these things are written, and a lot of these types of ethnography, this type of knowledge, has been suppressed in my community. The work that Chuck Lang did in Cochiti, you know, they hide his book from kids at the Pueblo. You know, because only certain people are exposed to certain types of knowledge at certain stages in their life. You know, an important person in the Pueblo, like Diane said, a war chief, cacique, you know, he doesn't hold every single bit of knowledge in the Pueblo, and those types of knowledge are carefully compartmentalized and it's protected in that way. And when it's put out there in book form, ethnography form, it's dangerous, and it's also very powerful. So we have to like treat these early ethnographies very carefully, which is what I do in my own work. Look at them critically. They inform my work in many ways, but you know, I also look at them very discreetly and use them very, very, very carefully.
Thanks, Woody. Thanks. Really appreciate, again, just the depth of what you're talking about, and in terms of clarifying, excuse me, just in terms of clarifying what narrative really is about, and how we sometimes see constructive narrative, and then how people from the inside see that same narrative, as well as their own personal and community-based narratives. So, Brian, I'll give you the option to do the same question about Acoma, and Leslie White and a few other people have written about the Pueblo, Or the option, if you want to talk about the Indian Arts Fund, and talk about that as another way of collecting the pueblos and organizing them, and the way that it's been spoken about. You addressed that a little bit already, but I thought I'll give you the option of the two, since you're in the middle and the last one, to answer a very complicated question, which again, I appreciate so much about what you all have been saying about. Or you can pass completely.
Yeah, I was gonna say, is there a third option?
You can make it.
Well, just briefly on the issue of the Leslie White report, similar to what Woody just expressed, it's something that, you know, as children we didn't know about. We don't learn, even as adults. A majority of the tribal community have probably never read that report. Some of us who have either came across it by accident or as a result of coursework, and it is not seen as a piece of reference for our community. Thankfully, it's very choppy in its presentation of the more sensitive parts of culture, and sadly, it does contain some images that are very disturbing. And it's something that, you know, it's under the rug almost at Acoma. We don't really talk about it. I have 17 copies of it that I at some point went out and I was so furious.
Yeah, I have 3 copies of Harrington.
Yeah, just going to garage sales, used bookstores, and buying every copy I would come across. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. As far as the Indian Arts Fund, or any other similar initiative of that time, it just amazes me that so much material left our communities in over a short period of time. That's what it just astounds me. And every day when I walk into that office or into the IARC and look into Vault 1, I'm still blown away. And I always wish that there was some way we could get these back home. The good news is that they are here and they exist in other places. And going back to the issue of consultation and collaboration, is that there's some promise there in terms of educating and exposing and accessing information and accessing material. It will help us in our own preservation work at the tribal level. I think it will help to inform academia as time goes on. And so, yeah, thank you, Indian Arts Fund. Thank you, other collectors who really, took the initiative to preserve these materials. But shame on you others for all the other things that have happened in our history and still happens today. In terms of trying to access knowledge, the overflights during ceremonies, thanks for that. Pounding at the reservation boundaries, insisting to get in when you can't, and asking those questions that are just inappropriate. And I hope that through work like Woody's dissertation and others who have worked so tirelessly over the years to help educate and inform this greater public about these things will have a positive impact over time. So, yeah, there you go. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you again to the three of you for answering one of the most complicated questions. And I'm certainly well aware that some of that's none of my business to ask that question. So thank you so much. But I think it does, certainly as a practicing anthropologist, this type of viewpoint so much informs everything I do every day and the types of questions. And I think particularly with Woody and Brian, I've asked them seriously wrong questions, but always preface it by saying, I know I'm not supposed to ask this. At least give them the option to, but they know, I think they've been incredibly generous, and I think that is a huge part of the Pueblo communities that us as outsiders go in and out of, that although these tragic things have happened inside these communities, people are still generous. They still welcome us on feast days and other days. It's really quite a stupendous type of thing. I think one thing I'd just add on to Brian's comment, that we think about these collections, we've been talking, we're here at the SAR where scholarship goes on and where they have this collection, other places in town. And we talk about collections, we talk about ownership is one of the things that museums often use. And I think just beginning to change language has a lot of power. And if we just start talking about stewardship, I think is a very huge change in terms of how we think about things. So now that we're kind of in this NAGPRA era over the last couple of decades, it's been a wonderful, positive change. But it hasn't really affected everything in a museum. NAGPRA still is often in its own little corner in the museum world where it's not integrated into the day-to-day. So you can see things being returned back to communities or community visits coming in, but you don't see, after the community goes back home, what's the long-standing impact? How is collections management or registration, curation, all the different functions that these institutions have, how is that actually being changed? And one of the ways we just start thinking about stewardship, it's a big change in thinking about you're caring for something, for someone, rather than I've got to take care of this because we own it. If you just consider for a moment, Brian yesterday in some comments, and certainly implicit in what we heard today, is the idea of things going back to communities, being returned to communities, what we call repatriation. Now, Acoma community, as an example, I'll use Acoma because Brian brought it up yesterday, has received things back. And, but of the numbers of things received back, there's a greater number still in museums' hands. We were pressed with this problem here at MIAC Lab when I was there, and certainly in Washington, that we had 1,000 pieces from a community. And the community would come in, they'd take 2 pieces back home, but we'd still have that relationship because we had had our hands on those pieces, our being the museum world, and then those 998 pieces that remained in Washington, that meant there was a relationship. So that goes to some of the points that Diane was making. That's the unspoken part that needs more exposure at this point. And that's a big reason, again, for talking about narrative and some of these very complicated little things. You know what happened to William Whitman, don't you? Do you know this part about, so the ethnographer who lived in the village, he died at a very young age with 2 small children.
His wife had to publish the...
And his wife published, and his daughter lived here for a long time, and she always claimed because he lived in the village and did all the wrong things, was actually witched by the village. Was always her comment about her father, which I always thought was interesting. I thought now that we'd open it up for some questions or their comments, unless there's something I've left undone here. So the question is about the Cross of the Martyrs, which was actually erected as part of the fiestas in the 20s as a way to honor those Franciscans that had fallen in 1680, but it doesn't mention any of the other people who suffered before that, or the Pueblo people, yes. I don't know if you know that every year at Indian market time, the cross is painted red. Does anybody in the room know that?
I didn't know that, that's a no.
So every year at Indian market time, much to the Fiesta Council's consternation, the cross gets painted red, even when they have people watching it 24 hours. Anybody want to answer that a little bit? Diane, please.
I was there, I think it was in 1990, as scouting location for another documentary called Gathering Up Again, Fiesta in Santa Fe. So I was scouting locations, so that we knew that they ended up there at the last part of Fiesta. So I went up there, and I make a long story short, there was a Franciscan addressing the group at the end of the Fiesta. And what he said was, in reference to that, that these Franciscans who were killed were not killed. Martyrs are people who die for their faith. But he said these people, the Franciscans, didn't die because of their faith. They died because they were Spanish. He didn't consider them martyrs at all because of the context of the time. So that was the most interesting thing about the Cross of the Martyrs.
Yeah, and I guess these reactions to these types of monuments are what Bruce mentioned, you know, painting the Cross of the Martyrs red, or the monument to Oñate in Alcalde. Yeah, well, that one too, and the one up north of Española, you know, whose foot gets severed every so often by who knows who. But these are you know, these are reactions to these types of these monuments. They're symbolic kind of reactions. But I think the you know, the most symbolic of these reactions is the you know, the placing of Popeye in National Statuary Hall in D.C. I think that's the most symbolic reaction to any of these monuments, that just kind of overshadows what the Cross of the Martyrs, or what the statue in Cathedral Park, or the statue up in Alcalde, what they miss is being captured by his presence up in D.C. So I think that's kind of the biggest reaction, which took a lot of work to do. And so I think that's one of the biggest reactions to these monuments.
What he's referring to, Statuary Hall, U.S. Capitol, every state is allowed 2 figures in the hall, and the first is Senator Chavez, and then the second is Popeye, who, like 2002, I think, something like that, so was installed there. Yes?
The interesting thing about Popeye's statue is that we leave cornmeal at that statuary hall because he's more than history. You know, he's relevant to our lives. So I don't know other statues in that hall that where cornmeal's left.
I don't think so. Well, I was fortunate to be in Washington at the time, and what we were able to do was, when he came to the border of the District of Columbia, we then took on the process of housing him for about 2 weeks before he moved to the Capitol, as well as moving him into the Capitol building, which meant he had to lie down to go down the hallways. But and it was a great event, actually, because the Capitol, in the rotunda, the Capitol, it was solid Pueblo people. It was very, very different type of event than they usually have in the Capitol building, for sure. And there were actually eagles flying over the buildings that day. Any other questions? Thank you, Diane. And thank you to the 3 panelists. This so much appreciate your sitting here, as was expressed, that you've been so open, sharing. And I know I've learned a lot today, as I always do, and I really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for coming today. So we'll see you next time.